We're getting started, and I think everybody here has been to our meetings before. Have you been before, Pamela?
Yes, uh-huh.
Okay, so I don't need to really do any introductions other than I'll introduce Cynthia because she was the one that suggested that we show the video of Katherine Hayhoe. So, Cynthia, why don't you explain who Katherine Hayhoe is if you're not familiar with her?
Okay. She's a very well-known climate scientist. She's Canadian, initially, but she's working in Texas now, I think University of Austin. Um, and she's a great, climate communicator, and she deals with the positive of what can be done. And so in this particular case, this video, she decides that she's going to answer emails that she's gotten from climate deniers who have listened to her talks previously and come up with their own comebacks to it. And at Thanksgiving, when grandpa or uncle, somebody comes up with some of the some of the denier's Bible, and it's some quasi-scientific thing, and you haven't really got an answer for them. Well, she's got the answer for them. And she gets into some things that I actually hadn't heard before, so I think it was a good way for us to see what she's doing lately.
Okay. Bill, are we ready to start?
It was great meeting you and speaking with you the other day, and you had so many good questions that we did not get to that I am making this bonus video to answer your top questions. So here we go. The most outvoted question related to solutions. It says electric vehicles, and other questions included wind and solar energy, are great, but what about the carbon footprint from lithium mines? And then what about the disposal of the batteries, the turbines, and the panels when they can't be used anymore? This is something I think of as the magic energy argument. I talk about it in this Twitter thread here. There should be some magical form of energy that has zero impacts of any kind, and until we get there, we should just keep using fossil fuels. That is the implication of this type of argument. Now, of course, there is no magical source of energy. But there are sources of energy that are not so good, and there are sources of energy that are really, really terrible. And so transitioning from fossil fuels, which are responsible for 10 million premature deaths a year due to air pollution alone, as well as driving the largest change in climate humans have ever seen, which could lead to the extinction of at least 30% of all species on Earth before the end of this century, not to mention displacing nearly 1 billion people just from coastal areas alone. We could have energy from that source, or we could get energy from sources that, yes, they do still have issues with mining. Yes, they do still have issues with recycling. But we can do better on those. And as my colleague Zeke Housefather says here, for example, mining is an unavoidable part of a clean energy transition, but impacts can and must, in my opinion, be minimized. All energy alternatives come at a cost. If you're investing in biofuels, they displace farmland. The question should not be, is there any impact? Because that's an unrealistic question. We don't live in a perfect world. But the question should be, is it substantially better than fossil fuels? And if it is, we should be doing it. Now, of course, there's substantial improvements that need to be made. So first of all, we need to use our energy more efficiently. We waste 67% of the energy we produce. And so through efficiency, we can reduce the amount of energy we need in the first place. That should be our first step. And I know that's something that concerns many of you on your campuses. What else can we do? We have to figure out how to effectively recycle batteries. And one thing that Tesla does, for example, is they do recycle the batteries in the Teslas. We have to figure out how to recycle turbine blades and solar panels, and people are working on that today. And we have to prevent the massive human rights violations and local environmental pollution caused by mining. However, let's just look at rare earth mining compared to mining in general. Check out this figure. Most of the mining we do is for iron ore, then industrial metals, Technology and precious metals are only a tiny fraction. And so if reducing the environmental harm of mining is our primary concern, there are a lot of places we need to be focusing before we get to rare earth minerals in most cases, not all. Cobalt from the Congo, I would say, is one significant exception. It's also important to recognize that these issues are also at the forefront of many researchers' minds. And so every year, there are new battery technologies being developed that use less of these minerals, or even in some cases, none of these minerals, like cobalt. The other thing we have to consider is, what are the environmental harms of fossil fuel extraction? Now, I didn't get much into this during my talk, but I did mention that fossil fuel extraction causes enormous local pollution issues. It contaminates air and water and soil, as well as contributing to systems of oppression and human rights violations too. From oil and gas extraction in the Niger Delta to fracking in Pennsylvania, the immediate health impacts of fossil fuels dwarf the impacts of rare earth minerals. So yes, we always need to do better, but let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good. Why the EV push when they're so environmentally unfriendly to produce and unrealistic for the average population? Well, first of all, a lot of the pollution I talked about that's responsible for those 10 million premature deaths comes from tailpipe emissions. So the number one reason to push for EVs and for public transportation and for walkable cities is the impact on human health. We also know that across the United States, the effectiveness of an EV depends on how clean the grid is. So if you live in, I bet you didn't know this, the state that has the most clean energy of any state, South Dakota, 83%, then EVs are a great choice there. This data is a little on the old side. It's actually 2 years old. So here in Texas, we are already well over 35% and on our way to 40%. You can see other states are catching up, especially states in the Midwest and the Southeast. But overall, electricity, even if it comes from natural gas, is a cleaner and more efficient way to run cars and vehicles than burning gas in the actual vehicle. In terms of cost, the costs are coming down. Part of the Inflation Reduction Act was intended to lower those costs. There's also more used vehicles available than there were, and it's estimated that by 2030, 56% of new cars sold in the United States will be EVs, and those aren't going to be the expensive luxury models. Those are going to be affordable vehicles for people and help save them money, because electricity for many of them will be cheaper than paying for gas all the time. How does this look around the world? Well, renewable and nuclear sources now make up 39% of global energy. Solar is the fastest growing source of energy. Solar is going to provide 54% of new US generating capacity in 2023. And a new Bloomberg report predicts that there's going to be so much new solar capacity deployed between now and 2030 that it's going to be 3 times what we have installed already to date. So again, there is no perfect solution to climate change. There's no silver bullet, but there's a lot of silver buckshot. EVs are part of that, as are, again, public transportation, as are, again, walkable cities, and even teleworking. Then there were a number of really great questions that centered around the role of universities. For example, what's the number one thing that universities can do to have a positive impact on climate change? Also, how can universities make an impact if legislation doesn't follow? And then, I love this question, I'm a student and I'm hearing how and what our institutions can do for us, but what can we do for our institution? Climate change is very real and scary to my generation, and I often feel powerless. This question is so good because it echoes what I was talking about during my presentation, which is that the younger generation, the vast majority of them understand the urgency of action and support it. So let me start at the end and work my way backwards. Students, you often don't realize that administrations pay more attention to you than they do to faculty, because a university pays the faculty's salary, but students pay the salary of the administration. So students, use your voices. When you see large-scale changes that a university have made, not all the time, but often, sometimes long years, doesn't happen right away, but long years of student advocacy are often at least one of, if not the primary catalyst for that change. So students, you have voices and you definitely can use them. What can a university do? What's the most important thing you can do? Well, that's a good question, because obviously it's really important, if you haven't taken a lot of action yet, to establish a baseline. You need to know where you're starting from in order to measure how much you're accomplishing. If you've already done that, then you need to look at the low-hanging fruit. What are the easiest things that you can do with a quick return to show people the benefits of positive, sustainable action? If you've already done the low-hanging fruit, it's time to look a bit higher. What are the out-of-the-box things that you might not have considered doing before that you could, especially over a bit of a longer time horizon? Take a look around at what other universities and colleges are doing. Are there any new ideas that they're trying out that you could too? But if I had to pick one thing, it would be this. Talk about what you're doing. Make sure the students know what you're doing and why. Make sure the faculty know what you're doing and why. Make sure the administration, the donors, the trustees know what you're doing, why, and how it benefits the university. Do not be shy to toot your own horn, because if you don't do it, who is? It's so important that people understand that changes can be made, that they are effective. Announce what you're doing. Put signs on what you're having. Actually, after I met with you, I went over to Arizona State University, which, as you know, has put solar panels on the roof of their stadium many, many years ago, and they're very sustainable in many ways. And I was walking up to the building that houses the Global Institute for Sustainability with a number of colleagues. And one of my colleagues pointed at this fenced-in area with this big sort of silver cylinder in it. Actually, I'll show you a picture right here so you can see what I was looking at, and sort of like a crane that would lift the cylinder. And he said, "Do you know what that is?" And I, a climate scientist, said, "I have no idea what that is, like absolutely no idea." And I looked around and there was no sign. There was no way for me to tell what that was. So I said, "Well, I give up. What is it?" And he said, "It's an artificial tree. That cylinder, they raise it up, it sucks in CO2, it lowers, and they take that CO2 out. So it is actually a form of direct air capture of CO2 from the atmosphere." And I, a climate scientist, had no way of knowing that. What a lost opportunity. Put a giant sign on that thing. Tell people what it's doing, tell people why it's doing it, and tell people how that university is part of the solution. That, in my opinion, is the single most important thing that every single one of us can do. Now, what if legislation doesn't follow? Well, if legislation doesn't follow, what can you do without that legislation, first of all, is the obvious question. But what can you do to bring legislators on campus, especially alumni, and show them what you're doing at the university and how that's making a difference? Where do legislators get their staff from? Typically from your universities. What are you teaching your students about how to integrate sustainability and climate action into policy across the entire political spectrum? You have so many chances to engage with and influence legislators and legislation. Don't be discouraged, because often that's the last thing to change, but you can play a key role in making it happen. A related question brings it down to the personal level. What's the most important change that each of us can make in our lives today? Well, again, we can set our baselines. You can step on the carbon scales. This is a carbon footprint calculator called the Cool Calculator from UC Berkeley, and it's one of the best ones out there, and you can measure your and your family's personal carbon footprint, and it will give you recommendations on what you can do to reduce your footprint. But even if all of us who were worried about this did everything we could to reduce our personal footprint, it's only a fraction of what's needed. Because in many cases, other people, they don't have, and even we do ourselves, we don't have the resources, the time, sometimes even the knowledge or the ability to make the best decision. We want the best decision to be the easiest and cheapest decision for everyone, and for that, we have to change the system. And how do we change the system? We change the system by using our voices to advocate for change. So that's why when I was asked to give a TED Talk a number of years ago, I gave a TED Talk on the most important thing every single one of us can do to make a difference. And what I said is, we have to talk about it. Not about the ice sheets and the polar bears, but we have to talk about why it matters here and now, where we live, affecting the people, the places, and the things we love. And we have to talk about what viable solutions look like for our school, or our place of work if it's different, for our neighborhood, for our community and our city, for our church, for our Rotary Club, for whatever organization we're part of. How does the system change? It changes when people within that system call for and advocate for that change. And that, in my opinion, is the most important thing that we can do as individuals. This is a great question that I think about a lot. In your opinion, what are the biggest barriers to acting with the degree of urgency necessary to make sufficient changes? First of all, let's talk about what the barriers are not. The barriers are not more science. We have known since the 1800s that digging up and burning coal back then, and obviously more oil and gas today, produce heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to warm. By the 1960s, scientists were so concerned about the catastrophic impacts of this warming on human society that they took the unprecedented step of warning a US president, that president was Lyndon B. Johnson, of the risks associated with climate change. And the fact that scientists in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s knew about the potential catastrophic impacts of climate change are documented in scientific reports from that day, from Exxon, from Shell, from GM and Ford, from many of the companies that are primarily responsible for the majority of the carbon emissions that are sitting up in the atmosphere today. So lack of scientific understanding is not the biggest barrier. What about lack of technological solutions? Is that the biggest barrier? No, it turns out that with the solutions we have in hand today, we could get almost 80% of the way to where we need to be. Yes, we still need to figure out, and some are working on, solutions to high temperature industrial processes, solutions to, long haul flights where they have to carry their fuel with them and batteries are too heavy. We do have a few things we still need to figure out, but most of the technology is already there. What do we lack? We lack the political will to implement it. Our barriers are social, our barriers are political, and our barriers are economic. Did you know that in 2021, fossil fuels were subsidized at the global level to the tune of $11 million per minute, US dollars? And by 2022, they were subsidized to the tune of $16 million per minute. In 2022, the world's largest oil companies, BP, Shell, Saudi Aramco, and more, recorded the highest profits they have ever received. And what did they use those funds to do? They used those funds to slash their climate goals in half, to can their green energy programs. So the biggest barrier, in my opinion, to acting with the degree of urgency necessary to make sufficient change is the fact that our entire economic system is built to sustain our addiction to fossil fuels as long as possible. It is not a free market. It is a market heavily skewed in favor of fossil fuels. And so that is why the economists who won the Nobel Prize back in 2018 and most of the economists around the world all agree that a first step to correcting that imbalance is to put a price on carbon. And in fact, the country of Canada, where I'm from, and over 40 other nations around the world have prices on carbon to correct that market imbalance and enable people to make the choices based on the actual cost of using those fossil fuels. Now, this was a great question that related to water and lawns. How does greening neighborhoods interact with lawn removal or xeriscaping? Is there a trade-off between reducing water use and mitigating climate impacts? Just to refresh your memory, in the presentation I talked about how studies have shown that low-income neighborhoods in large cities, and Phoenix is no exception, can be up to 15 degrees hotter during a heat wave than high-income neighborhoods in the same city. And one of the biggest reasons for that is shade. More specifically, it's often shade from trees, from growing things. But as you pointed out correctly, more grass, more trees requires more water. So it's really important to focus on native species, and it's also important to focus on different types of shade. And I know that the city of Phoenix, for example, is considering that, as well as the university, ASU, and many of your campuses as well. The important thing is shade. There's multiple ways to get it, but often very strategic planting, because there's very few places where you can't plant something, can be a huge help. Do you believe, the question says, that humans are the precise cause of climate change, or is it part of the cyclical rhythm of the Earth? So I want to start by highlighting a word there that you might not have caught, which is the word believe. And my answer to any question that asks about the science and says, do you believe it, is no. I do not believe it because it's not a religion. As a scientist, I can look at the data and I can determine whether it is a natural cycle or not. So that is what I and my colleagues have done, and here are the results. When people say natural cycles or the cyclical rhythm of the earth, what's interesting is often people don't even know what that is. If I say, well, what is a natural cycle? They're really hard pressed to explain. So let me explain to you what natural cycles are. There are two types of natural cycles. The first type occurs outside the earth. These are orbital cycles caused by changes in the shape of the Earth's orbit over time. Over time, the Earth's orbit can become more circular and then more elliptical. Also, the Earth's angle of rotation is inclined relative to its orbit. So over time, it precesses like a top. If you've ever spun a wooden child's top, you spin it and it goes around really quickly. That's like the Earth going around once every day. But you know that it also goes around like this. That's precession, and the Earth does that too. So how does that create a cycle that influences temperature on the Earth? Well, if the Earth were all the same all the way around, if it was all ocean, if it was all ice, if it was all desert and sand, if it was identical in every part, then it wouldn't. But we know that the Earth is very different. There's a lot more land in the northern hemisphere. There's a lot more ocean in the southern hemisphere. And so as different parts of the Earth are pointed more towards or away from the sun, what happens is it changes where solar energy falls on the Earth. And that leads to the ice ages and the warm interglacial periods like we are in today. This was discovered by a scientist, Milutin Milankovic, back in the 1920s. So we have known about the cause of these orbital cycles for 100 years. We can calculate where we are on that cycle. So where are we? Are we in a warming phase? No. In fact, warming due to orbital cycles peaked about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. And since then, if we look at the data, we can see that the Earth was in fact gradually cooling since then, thanks to orbital cycles, until something happened about 200 years ago. So we know that according to natural cycles, we should be very slowly, gradually cooling, eventually heading into another ice age in about 1,500 years. And believe me, another ice age is not what we want. What do we want? We like it just right, like Goldilocks, right? We don't want it too hot. We don't want it too cold. We want it just right. But studies have interestingly shown that apparently the development of agriculture, large herds of ruminants that produce a lot of heat-trapping gases, and the large-scale deforestation that accompanied agriculture to plant crops produces enough heat-trapping gases that by the 1800s, we humans had serendipitously just balanced out the ice age or orbital cycles. So if it weren't for the Industrial Revolution, we would have perfectly stabilized Earth's climate to make it absolutely perfect for us. But then the Industrial Revolution happened, and now we are warming faster than any time in human history. That's how we know it's not an orbital cycle, because if it was, we'd be getting cooler, not warmer. Now, there's a second type of natural cycles too, and these natural cycles happen inside the climate system. They are part of the self-regulating nature of the Earth, where you have cycles like El Nino and La Nina. That's one of the natural cycles I'm talking about, where what they do is they move heat between the ocean and atmosphere and back again, and they sometimes move heat from east to west or north to south. What they're doing is they're regulating the temperature of the Earth, but they cannot create heat because that would violate conservation of energy. You can't create heat out of nothing. So with a natural cycle, what they do is they rob Peter to pay Paul. If one part of the Earth is getting warmer, it's because the heat is coming from the other part of the Earth. So let me give you an example of a natural cycle. Back in the medieval times, there was something that we often call the medieval warm period. And during that period, it was unusually warm over the North Atlantic. Vikings made it all the way across to Newfoundland in Canada. Greenland was also populated, not because it was actually green, but because it was probably one of the first recorded instances of really clever advertising. By the time people got there and realized it wasn't green, it was too late. but at least it was relatively balmy compared to what it normally was, so people could get there. But, and this is an example of our Western Europe-centric culture, if you look at historical temperature data from what we call natural thermometers, tree rings, ice cores, pollen records, you see that at the very same time that we were calling it the medieval warm period in Northern Europe, if you lived in Siberia, it was the medieval cold period. This is a classic natural cycle. Warmer over here, colder over there, up and down like a teeter-totter or a seesaw. So what does today look like? Is it just getting warmer in a certain place while it's getting cooler over here? No. This is the temperature of the Earth using the same temperature scales I just showed you, except for the last decade. This is how we know that it is not an internal natural cycle like El Nino, because the entire planet is warming. And we know it's not an orbital cycle either, because according to those, we should be getting cooler, not warmer. Now, I'm going to throw in two bonuses here, because people often ask too, well, how do we know it isn't the sun just getting brighter? Because we've been tracking the sun's energy and it's been going down the last 50 years too. So if our temperature were being controlled by the sun or natural cycles, we should be getting cooler, not warmer. And then people often say, but what about volcanoes? Doesn't one volcanic eruption produce more pollution than people do in 30 years? No, it doesn't. In fact, the primary thing that volcanoes produce are sulfate aerosols. And what those do is they act like an umbrella up in the atmosphere, reflecting the sun's energy back to space, cooling the planet. Now, geologic activity, not as much volcanoes, but other, like fissures in the earth or mud volcanoes, and some volcanoes too. But geologic activity does let some heat-trapping gases from deep within the Earth's core leak out into the atmosphere. But it's estimated that all geologic activity around the whole world produces the heat-trapping gases equivalent to 3 medium-sized US states. So no, volcanoes do not produce more heat-trapping gases than humans. Humans far outweigh all geologic activity on Earth. Those were the most upvoted questions. But now I'm going to go for a final bonus round. I'm going to do the most downvoted questions. Yes, because honestly, I think that answering those are the most important, because those are questions that you're going to hear, and it's important to know how to respond. So here are the 3 most downvoted questions. Number 1, your examples are anecdotal. Show us charts over hundreds of thousands of years. There's not enough history to prove it's human caused. Challenge accepted. Here we go. First of all, this is the chart that I showed you when I spoke. It shows observed temperature over the last 150 years, 172. And as you can see, the temperature goes up and down from year to year because that's weather, but decade by decade, it marches steadily up. Now, why does this chart begin in 1850? It's because that was the year by which we had enough thermometers around the entire world to calculate a true global average. The longest thermometer record in the world goes back to the 1650s in central England, so we did have thermometers for 200 years before that, but we didn't have enough to calculate a global average. So that's why this figure begins in 1850. So how do we know what temperature was like before the 1850s? Well, like I said, we had some thermometers, but what we more often use are natural thermometers. We can track when certain plants or trees bloomed or flowered, and we know what temperature it would require for that to happen. We can also use ice cores and tree rings. The width and density of the tree ring tells us about temperature and precipitation every single year, 1 ring for each year. We can use other what we call proxy records to go back hundreds, thousands, and even millions of years into the past. And in fact, when we look at paleoclimate records, which is what we call it, what they show us is how unusual today is and how much more alarming what's happening today is compared to if we just look at the last 150, 200 years. As far back as we can go in the history of this planet, we have never seen this much carbon going into the atmosphere this quickly. The closest analogy was 55 million years ago, and at that time it's estimated that only 10% of the carbon we're producing today was going into the atmosphere from natural causes. So paleoclimatologists, as we call people who study past climate, are absolutely worried to death over what's happening today because they know just how far we're pushing the planet from what was normal. So what has been normal? Let's go back 2,000 years. And as you can see, temperature goes up and down from year to year. You can see the medieval warm period was actually not a warm period if you look globally, right? You can see the Little Ice Age was in fact a global cooler period due to a combination of lower solar energy and some big volcanic eruptions. But then look at the last 200 years. That curve is going straight up. It looks nothing like what's been happening in the last 2,000 years. All right, well, what about the last 15,000 years, 10,000 years? Here we go. This is global average temperature over the last 12,000 years. So what you see is temperature coming out of the last ice age. You can see that it peaked between 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, and then you can see that it started to decrease until when? Until the last 200 years. Now, I want to point out something important. This figure ends in the year 2000. We're in the year 2023. Where does that red line go today? That red line is actually off the figure. That star should be higher. I just didn't have enough room. So once again, if we look 15,000 years back, we are nowhere near what natural causes should look like. Today looks even more unusual. All right, so let's use ice core data to go even further back. Let's go back almost 1 million years. What does that look like? Well, over 1 million years, you can see that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have gone up and down over time, and that is caused by orbital cycles. And if you put temperature on this figure with it, you can see that temperature goes up and down with the orbital cycles. But what's been happening today? Well, here's another figure from the National Climate Assessment that shows that historical range, and we had to shrink it down because where we are today, this figure was made 10 years ago, where we are today is already that second purple dot, not the first one, the second one. We are already so far out of the ballpark of any conditions that humans have experienced on this planet that it's amazing we're still doing as well as we are. And if we don't do something seriously, we're headed into unknown territory. So yes, we do have enough history to prove that without a doubt, it is human caused. And people often say, okay, well, how much of it is human caused? My answer might surprise you, but if you think about it, you'll figure it out. More than 100% is human caused. And you might say, well, how could more than 100% be human caused? It's because, according to natural factors, we should be doing what? We should be cooling, not warming. So that's why more than 100% of the warming is human caused, because according to natural factors, the sun, volcanoes, and orbital cycles, we should be getting cooler, not warmer. Instead, we're warming faster and faster. Now, that focused on temperature, but the next most downvoted question relates to extreme events, which I talked about quite a bit in my presentation. Remember how I shared that extreme events are becoming more frequent and more severe. And I also emphasized that we have always had extreme events. We've always had heat waves. We've always had droughts. We've always had wildfires and hurricanes and storms. They're a natural part of life on this planet. But when we look at the statistics of these events, we see that heat waves are getting more frequent and more dangerous. The season is longer, they're coming earlier and they're staying later. We see that heavy rainfall is increasing. Hurricanes are getting stronger, not more frequent. And wildfires are burning greater area. So this question said, doesn't California burn naturally every 200 years? Wildfires in California are part of the ecosystem. But what is not part of the ecosystem are the record hot and dry conditions caused by climate change. And here's the difference. So imagine that you accidentally drop a match, and remember, most wildfires in the Western US are the result of accidental human ignition. About 7% are arson, most are accidental ignition. So imagine that you accidentally drop a match into a pile of, fairly green wood. What happens? Not much. A bit of a fire, but not a big deal. Then imagine that you accidentally drop that match into a pile of bone-dry kindling with tons of dry grass and dry leaves. It will go off like a bonfire. That's the difference between with or without climate change. I have a global weirding episode that explains this. All this extreme weather we've had isn't anything new, right? It's such a common talking point, but we have scientific answers for it. So if you want more, please check this out. This question went on, though, and it said, the speech seems like political talking points. here's where it gets interesting, because you know why it seems like political talking points? Instead of endorsing conservative solutions, many conservative politicians in the United States, increasingly in Canada, Australia, and the UK as well, have chosen to simply deny the reality of the problem, because if it isn't real, you don't have to fix it. So what we hear as a result are what I call science-y sounding arguments. It's not real. Those scientists are cooking the data. It's just a natural cycle, which we dealt with. It definitely isn't. It's not so bad. We've survived worse before. We have not. But all of those arguments, which I think of as a 5-point scale, as you can see here, it's not real, it's not us, it's not bad, we can't fix it, and oops, it's too late anyways. All of those arguments have the same goal. The goal is to prevent action as long as possible. And so, yes, there are a lot of political talking points about climate change, but every single one of those political talking points against the reality of this issue and the urgency of action are all trying to prevent action. How and when did climate change become politicized? It wasn't back in the 1800s when scientists were drawing the connection between fossil fuels and temperature. It wasn't in the 1930s when scientists showed that the planet was warming already. It wasn't even in the 1960s or 70s when National Academy scientists and the scientists employed by Exxon and Shell and BP were showing the people they worked for, whether it was the government or the companies, that there were potentially catastrophic impacts from continuing to burn fossil fuels. When did the science become politicized? It became politicized when people started to see that the impacts were happening now instead of in the future. Why? Because when something's happening now, it means we have to do something about it. And when we have to do something about it, that's when the politics comes in. And so this issue became politicized in the late 80s and the early 90s when massive heat waves started to wake people up to something is different, when James Hansen from NASA testified before Congress saying it was real, when the first IPCC report came out in 1990, that is when the science became politicized, when action became urgent. People chose, in some cases, to delay action as long as possible by questioning the science through political talking points. Now, if you're interested in more, there's some really good books on this. I highly recommend reading or watching Merchants of Doubt. And I also recommend another book called The Petroleum Papers. Both of these explain how climate change got politicized, and they are fascinating and depressing reading. Now, the last question. Did you take a plane to get here? I love hypocrites. Now, this is extremely common, shaming people to shut them up. In fact, it's so common that I wrote a Twitter thread about it. I said the other day on Twitter, I decided to conduct an experiment. I set a timer for 3 hours, and I counted how many times I was publicly shamed here on Twitter. The answer was 12 in 3 hours. And since then, I've seen dozens of examples of others being shamed as well. Just over half of mine came from people on the right-hand side of the political spectrum using tried and true denial technique, impossible expectations. In other words, you're only allowed to talk climate action if you essentially stop breathing and live off the grid. Well, are you going to change anything if you stop breathing and live off the grid? No. The only way we can change a system is if we live within it. The system is not perfect, but what we can do is we can strive every day to make it better. So you can see how this argument is designed to shut people up and to stop them from engaging. Whereas we need to do the opposite. We need to be vocal about the need for change so that the easiest and most affordable choice for everyone, not just people who care about climate, is the best solution. But here's where it gets really interesting, because what I have found over the last year and a half is that the other half of these guilting and shaming comments come from people who are very clearly concerned about and invested in climate action. Something I said or didn't say violated their 10 commandments of green living, and they wanted to make sure I knew it. What has happened? What's happened is, first of all, the impacts of climate change and the risk of inaction are so severe that for many people, a defense mechanism is to try to control people around them. They feel like, well, if I get somebody to do the right thing, then maybe it's not going to be so bad. Well, here's the problem. Unless someone is one of the biggest multinational oil and gas companies in the world, that isn't going to fix the problem. 90 corporations are responsible for 70% of carbon emissions since the dawn of the industrial era. Our individual light bulbs and EVs and diets are not going to fix the problem by themselves. So what will? What will is changing the system. And what do we need to use to change the system? Our voices. And what are these comments trying to do? They're trying to silence our voices. So these comments, whether they're coming from one side or the other side of the spectrum, believe me, they come from both these days. They are all trying to accomplish the same thing, which is to shut down climate action. Marianne Hegler is a journalist, and I think she puts this perfectly here. She says, the belief that this enormous existential problem could have been fixed if all of us had just tweaked our consumptive habits is not only preposterous, it is dangerous. It turns environmentalism into an individual choice defined as a sin or a virtue, convicting those who don't or can't uphold these ethics. When you consider that the IPCC report outlined that a vast majority of global greenhouse gas emissions come from just a handful of corporations, it's victim blaming, plain and simple. And I love this part. She says, when people come to me and confess their green sins as if I were some sort of eco-nun, I want to tell them that they are carrying the guilt of the oil and gas industry's crimes, that the weight of our sickly planet is too much for any one person to shoulder, and that blame paves the road to apathy, which can really seal our doom. So when you hear these questions and these arguments, do not fall for what misinformation expert John Cook calls FLICK, the 5 techniques of climate denial. So I just want to take you through this because it's kind of interesting to know. We see this in all different areas, not just climate. First of all is fake experts. So-and-so was the founder of the Weather Channel and he says climate change isn't real. Well, it turns out that he was a broadcast journalist, not a climate scientist. Logical fallacies. Climate has changed in the past for natural reasons, therefore it can only change for natural reasons in the future. That's like saying the only reason you've ever gotten sick before was a cold, so if you're sick in the future, it could only be a cold. We know instinctively that's ridiculous. It's a logical fallacy. Impossible expectations. We just addressed this one. Live off the grid. Stop breathing. Don't produce anything that affects anything around you. By the way, human breath produces CO2, but it's carbon that we just took in recently from eating, so it's net zero. But impossible expectations are basically intended to shut people down so that they won't advocate for change. Cherry picking. It's cold outside here today, so the planet can't possibly be warming over climate timescales. And then lastly, conspiracy theories. You know, all those scientists are just in it for the money. You will see these arguments, and what I want to share with you is that every single one of these arguments and every single one of the 5 elements of climate denial here, it's not real, it's not us, it's not bad, we can't fix it, it's too late. They're all aimed at the same thing, preventing action. And so when we address one directly, what happens is another one just pops right up again, like the whack-a-mole game at the carnival. So what do we have to do? We have to bypass right around them and address the root issue, which is solution aversion. People don't think that there are solutions that will lead us to a better future. And you know what? You know differently. You know that there are solutions that save us money. There are solutions that clean up our air. There are solutions that improve people's quality of life. And there are solutions that tackle climate change. So you have everything you need to have positive, constructive conversations about what's happening on your campus, why it matters to you, to your facilities, to your student body, to your investments, to your research, and what real solutions look like and the benefits they bring us today, as well as what they do for climate tomorrow. Thank you for all you do. It was a pleasure to spend this time with you.
Oh, David is asking that we show the 2 books again. I don't know if we can show those, but I know one of them was Merchants of Doubt. I think
Yeah.
there's a
And
movie.
the other one?
The Petroleum Papers is the other one.
The Petroleum Papers, okay.
Uh-huh.
So you'd have to Google who the authors are. One of them I
Yeah.
know was a movie also. Merchants of Doubt.
She said you could either get a book or watch the movie on it.
Well, what did everybody think?
Yeah, I thought she was awesome. Did a great job.
And positive.
Yes.
She was very positive, and That
Mhm.
is uplifting.
Right. Yeah, she's not a doom scroller or a doom person. Yeah, she makes you feel like we really can do something about it.
Yeah, that was the last thing that on the 5 things was it's too late anyway.
Uh-huh.
She
Right.
realized that.
I'm gonna have to add here that she was very Canadian. That is, we
Says
are
the
we are
Canadian.
all so nice.
And had a lot of good responses for the different questions or comments that people have.
And I want a link so I can share this with my friends and other people.
Is the video on YouTube?
Yes. And her website has lots and lots of videos. Plus she has um, she puts out weekly videos too, but this one's a little bit hard to find.
Yeah,
Real
I had trouble
simple.
finding it.
And this one will be this meeting will be linked on our website in a week or so. And we'll let you know when it's up.
I really like the fact that she hits all the arguments that you hear every time. You know, natural cycles. I mean, all of them. And she's just so quick and clear about it. And even now, having watched this twice, I couldn't answer the questions the way she did. I need to watch it 6 more times.
I agree.
Makes it look so simple.
Oh, Bill just put the website up on YouTube. He just put the link up in the chat. So you can grab that if you like. And there's a fair amount of, as I recall, when I tried to look at the video myself, there's a fair amount of introduction and talk at the end of it too, if that's the one I'm thinking of. So you don't start it at 0. Am I right on that, Cynthia? You
Think
have
so.
to you have to go in to get to her talk, I think about 19 minutes or something. Quite a
Oh,
bit.
I don't know if it's that long, but
Okay, maybe 9 minutes.
yeah, but there is, you know, she's thanking people because it's based on a talk that she gave recently. So she's thanking people for the ability to make that talk and so forth.
Yeah, so there's some extraneous material at the beginning that you can just go past. So I wanted to let people know that we're working on something for next month. Also, we have an intern, a young person, a junior at Mission Vista High School, someone who lives in Fallbrook, and she's going to be working on a panel discussion of students, of high school students. And we hope to also include some other Fallbrook High students on that too, from the Environmental Club, and have them talk about some climate issues and also how they personally feel about working on climate change and what their plans are. Might get some different perspectives from that group of young people.
Yeah.
To follow up on my note in the chat, there was an article in the New York Times yesterday, and the headline was "What Environmentalists Like Me Got Wrong About Climate Change," and it's by Carl Pope, who was the executive director of the Sierra Club from 1992 to 2010. And what he basically said, and his comment was, you know, carbon footprint, carbon capture, people know about carbon pollution, et cetera, et cetera. And he says that really that the environmental group should have focused on methane rather than carbon, because methane, it is a greenhouse gas. And Joy, you're right, it is a greenhouse gas that we focus on. But the thing is that it's he says, it wasn't until 3 years ago that I came to see the gravity of my mistake, that methane is an urgent problem, and that it's 80 times worse than carbon. And if we and most of it comes from oil and gas wells that leak. And if we had changed the regulations around that and spent money, basically, if there's an old well that's not producing anymore, then the owner doesn't worry about capping it properly and making sure that there's no methane escaping. And so if we would pay these bad actors who are neglecting their wells and basically try and get them to capture their methane, that would have really kind of a huge impact, as opposed to just focusing on carbon, which I thought that Katherine did a really good job of noting how people get shamed about whether their habits are, do you drive an electric vehicle, and did you take a plane here, stuff like that. So anyways, but it was just yesterday in the New York Times, and it was just a really interesting article that's still available on the New York Times.
I read the same story, Harriet, and Pope, who leads the Sierra Club.
What do you want?
Huh? Yeah, he brought up a really good point, because initially everybody thought that
Wanna go
methane was
outside?
just
Yeah,
Well,
everybody
so
thought that the
let's let you go
methane was
outside.
about cow farts, but it turns out that what it really is the drilling for fossil fuels, is that there's a lot of leakage of methane, more than we knew.
mhm. Well, actually, last year, California did pass a law to make to speed up the capping of idle oil wells. So hopefully we're working on that in California. We can't change the past, but there's an article in Cal Matters from September of 24 that talks about that. So once again, and last year we were getting federal funds to help us with that. Not sure what happened to those funds now.
I really liked one of Katherine Hayhoe's points, that humans are carbon neutral. That is, we eat food and then we exhale carbon, but we also eat food. So we are actually carbon neutral, because it's so easy to get shamed, of we're not doing, individuals are not doing enough. And I also liked her point about how the corporations were really generating so much carbon, and really it's changing the system. It's not changing the fact that I grow my own organic vegetables, or I walk around instead of using my car. I mean it's really I thought it was really kind of an interesting and supportive kind of point.
Right.
And she also talked, in the neighborhood of shaming, about the argument you hear about all the time, like, are electric cars a good idea? What about wind power? It kills birds. You come up with all the things that are wrong with a solution that is better than fossil fuels. And the argument is like, well, we can't do anything because we haven't got a perfect solution yet. And that's really important for her to point out. I don't even want to argue with people on those things anymore. Like, yep. So you can live with it as it is, or You can make it a little bit better, but you can't make it perfect.
Yeah, on one of her last slides, she showed all the examples of how the improvements can be, how we can talk about things in terms of, I mean, I just think about all the negative things you hear about on the financial shows. You hear all these negative things about EVs, for instance, all the, oh, they're too expensive and there's, various other things wrong with them. Their range isn't enough. But on the other hand, when I just think about how much money we save on buying gas, how much does the average person pay in filling their gas tanks? I mean, they're talking about gas going up to $8 and that's what the right wing talks about, that they like to dwell on gas is too much and there's too much taxes on gas. But why pay it? You don't have to pay it. Just get an EV, then you won't have to buy gas anymore. Same thing with solar panels. All this what is that German expression? Stern and something or other.
German drang.
Sermon drag
Dang.
about getting the all of our incentive, whether or not we're going to have the incentives to be able to get everybody to put rooftop solar on. Just get the rooftop solar. If you have to get a loan at 0% or even a couple percent, and your monthly payment will be less than what you're spending on your electric bill now for air conditioning.
Yeah.
So just do it, You can be spending your money on making your house better and improving um, your home value. But I think those are the kind of things we should be talking about rather than trying to get involved in all these arguments with people. Just show people how they can have a better life.
Exactly. How you can have a better life.
Right.
And expect to have a little shaming,
Mhm.
is worth it.
And spend less money on fossil fuels. Why do you want to spend your money on these poisons?
But humans are, in fact, I mean, we buy things that have long-term costs as opposed to buying a more expensive thing that has lower long-term costs. And the economic situation is real,
Yeah,
and
see,
for
watch
lots of
there.
families, it's really, really
Watch.
difficult to
See?
afford the
Do
money.
you hear?
It's true.
Well,
It's kind of hard to talk people into, like the experiment they do with kids, I
The
can give you
marshmallow
one
experiment,
candy.
yeah.
Yeah, I can give you one candy and you can eat it now, or if you wait a minute, I'll give you two, And we're just wired to take the easy thing that's now.
I mean, just a simple thing like house insulation. I mean, when my dad built our house back in the 50s, he put insulation in, and people thought he was nuts. Like, why are you wasting money like that? And of course, we had a comfortable house while everyone else suffered through Canadian winters, with leaky houses. But it's I mean, I see all around me people who don't consider the maintenance cost. Really, our houses could be a lot better, but they would cost a lot more, and then the maintenance costs would be a lot lower. But but it's hard to consider that when you're already stretched to your max, buying a house that isn't as efficient.
Right, because a lot of people don't know what the other side is, what they're missing out on. Now, it's hard when people live in apartments and they don't really have a place to plug in an electric car. That's I think those are the times we need to figure out collectively how we can help people out of their gas cars.
Well, also a network of charging stations, because right now I drive a hybrid and I'm not going to change because when I want a road trip up to Washington State or Arizona, um, basically I have to plan around the charging stations, and it becomes this whole extra chore, whereas there are gas stations on every corner. And um, really, I mean, even just here in Fallbrook, there are with the new charging stations that they've installed in Grocery Outlet, that's helped a lot. But for many years, it was just the library and FPUD. I mean, those were your only two options, and there were 4 charging stations for a town of 30,000. I mean, so
Yeah.
we really need the infrastructure to support the electric vehicle transition.
Yeah, and we need the transportation too. We need mass transit. And it is going to help if we do get that shuttle bus that goes from downtown Fallbrook to the park and ride down to the 395. Or it'll be an on-demand type of a shuttle bus system. That will really help.
Well, they've documented that people in Manhattan are healthier because they walk everywhere, because, the subway isn't that great, and it's a really dense city. And for me personally, I'm rooting for walkable towns and walkable cities. And I live in a place that is walkable throughout downtown. But honestly, I don't see a lot of other people walking. Basically, Americans seem to resist that sort of thing. And so I have to say I'm personally in favor of walkable places, but I think that transit and electric vehicles are more popular here in the U.S.
Yeah, I think we just have to stop building more lanes on the freeways to force people off the freeways. And that's a challenge.
We had a speaker some time back who, I think it was us, who did a presentation about walkable cities. Do you remember who that was?
Was it Carl?
Yeah, maybe it was, because it was so.
He's the one that rides his bike all over the place.
Yeah, and it was so utopian, this
Mhm.
idea. But he also explained how well, the reason we don't have walkable cities is because of the cars, of course, but not so much because of all the parking lots. And if you like, you can't walk from, say, Target to to the next store, because there's a half a mile of asphalt between you and the next store.
Right.
And how pleasant it would be if you could just go from place to place to place without having to get in your car, which is now 150 degrees inside, and then drive, a quarter of a mile down the street, park it again, close it. It just sounded so pleasant not to have to do that.
Was there a video of that talk?
Must be.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
was that the guy that talked about electric bikes and he biked everywhere?
Yeah, that
Ah,
was,
okay, okay.
yeah, that was the one. And we have someone else who wants to do a presentation on, he was here tonight for a minute, on the carb pricing. The
Huh.
California has a carb scoping plan where they figured out how we could reduce carbon by simply putting a price on parking, basically. And the only problem is there's nothing forcing us to do that. It's just a plan. All we have is a plan, but it's dependent on all of the other entities to put the mechanisms in place to enforce the plan. And so that's where the rubber meets the road.
Katherine
Yeah.
Hayhoe also mentioned about carbon pricing, and Canada has currently has a carbon pricing scheme, but I believe that's going to be terminated soon because it's so politically unpopular. And really, I mean, I completely get behind the idea of gas taxes that pay for road repairs as opposed to us having to repair our transmissions and our suspension when we bump through potholes. Really, I mean, there's got to be a better way of pricing things, because as it is with free parking everywhere and people just, it's an incentive to use your car.
Well, we have our own cap and trade program in California. And here's a link to it. And this is part of the California Air Resources Board, but it's part of our strategy, but it's not that mandatory, really. So I'll put the link up here too, and you can look at it.
These even, the carbon pricing, it's basically punishing people, and punishment really doesn't work to motivate change very much.
Mhm.
But what Hayhoe is talking about is, well, what she's saying is do it because it makes your life better.
Right.
Yeah, like it's what you were saying, Joy.
Mhm.
Spend the money on the solar to make your life better because your bills will go down and
Right.
you can charge your car and whatnot.
Yeah, and you don't have to sit at a hot house worrying about how much your bill is going to be because you've got the sun taking
Right.
care of you, giving you electricity during the day.
Yeah. Now that's encouraging. Oh, I want that.
It's a better life. Yeah.
It's not so much that I don't want to, pay this higher carbon tax. I just want to pay fewer bills and have a nicer life.
Be more
And
comfortable. Yeah.
all of the things that we could do as individuals to promote a reduction in climate change are also going to make our lives a lot nicer.
Mhm.
Skies.
Right. And healthier. We're healthier.
Right.
Well, we should probably wrap it up. We've actually gone 10 minutes overtime.
Should.
Just one final note, and that is that the cool zones right now are the only one listed is the library, whereas last year it was also included the wellness center and the community center. So I don't know what's going on with that, but right now we are down to one cool zone for cooling off in hot weather, and that is the library, which is not open on Sundays. So
Yeah. Yeah, and it turns out, and you found out that they're willing to be open on Sunday if needed.
yes.
If the county would simply ask them to do that.
But the county requires a temperature above a certain level, and I think
90
it's 90
degrees.
degrees, yeah.
Yeah.
And honestly, I have to say, by 90 degrees, I've melted into a puddle. But thankfully, I have a heat pump based air conditioning, a mini split thing, which I can basically turn on anytime I want because it really does not use a lot of power. But it was also expensive and required a retrofit for my house. So, you know,
Yeah, well, 90 degrees is probably what they've determined is the temperature where you start losing people, where people become sick or even pass away, because it's going to be even hotter than that inside their houses or their apartments. So, yeah, we should probably contact the county or our elected representative with the county and complain about that and say that we need to have a cooling zone 7 days a week in Fallbrook.
yes, at least during the afternoon, which is the worst of the heat. Like basically, 10 to 1 does not cut it. It really needs to stay open until 5 or 6 o'clock until it starts to cool down here.
Well, if anybody wants to draft a letter, they can do that. And I think the FCAT will support signing it. I'm not sure everybody in our group would sign that. And we can send that to our elected representative or maybe even the whole county board of supervisors.
Do we know if these cooling centers are being used on the days they are available? If we don't have the data, they're gonna say, why should I keep it open another day if nobody's coming anyway?
That's
Well, I
the
don't
other
think,
problem. That's the other problem is politicizing or basically letting people know that that the cool zone is there and it's available. Because I mean, for example, the cool zone of the library, if you live out on Retchy Road, then it's not going to be really convenient to go there. And then you have to know that it's available. So I don't know what the problem. I don't know how to politicize or how to publicize it more.
Well, you're doing your best, Harriet.
Well, yeah, I do my best, and I'm basically the library. They don't even mention the fact that they're a cool zone. I mean, they're just sort of there, and whenever they're open, yeah, you can come and it's an air conditioned building. So there's a little triangle sign in the front window, but a lot of people who don't patronize the library would not know or would not know to go there. So
maybe we should try to have that advertised through the schools.
actually, that might be a good idea because if the kids know, then if the kids take home a notice to their families or something, because there are a lot of, again, the problem of apartments, Joy, that
Right.
that there are a lot of people in apartments where if you don't have air conditioning, or if you can't afford the electric bill to turn on your air conditioning.
Yeah, the schools are out for the summer now, but we're still going to have hot days in September. So maybe we can approach the schools and see if they can send something home.
Well, they go back in August, do they not?
Yeah,
Yeah.
end of August. And there's summer school happening too in the summertime. At least there is in the elementary school system. Okay, well, that's more stuff that we can still be working on. So if anybody wants to take the lead on that, then let us know what you're doing and we'll endorse it. Okay, well, I guess we're gonna say goodbye then, and we'll see you next month. Thanks for coming, everybody.